Hello everyone and welcome to this morning's event. I'm John Connell and I'd like to introduce Matthew Tevlin, my colleague here. We're delighted to welcome you this morning. I'm a writer and a farmer and a mental health spokesman for health matters and mental well-being. Matt Tevlin is going to introduce himself now as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Tevlin. I'm a psychotherapist based in Selfcare in County Kildare. So at the moment I'm working with Pieta House and I currently run a private practice as well.
Great. So we're here today to talk about depression and anxiety, and we're going to touch a little bit on burnout as well. There, I suppose, no easy task to talk about, and there's no clear one-size-fits-all remedy for people, but we will guide you on our experience, both personal from myself and professional and clinical from Matt, about dealing with mental health and anxiety. So depression and anxiety are parts of life, and depression will affect 1 in 4 of us at some point in our lives. So it is going to be a close thing. We are probably going to know someone who suffers with depression at some point. And anxiety, the numbers are always a little bit unclear, but it's a factor of life, and our modern stressful lives are part of that. And then burnout stemming from work is sadly a part of modern life too, and something that some of us may have dealt with or need to deal with. So Matt's on hand here to give us the clinical view of what depression is and anxiety is and how to spot the signs. So Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you to tell us a little bit about what exactly is depression.
Thanks very much, John. Yeah, depression can be a very serious condition that really negatively affects how you feel, how you think, and how you act. It's usually accompanied by intense feelings of sadness, and people often think depression is just deep sadness, but it's actually different from ordinary sadness. I suppose the main difference is that depression is a lot more pervasive and that it lasts for weeks, months, and even in some cases years, whereas sadness kind of tends to kind of come and go. The signs of depression to watch out for are low moods, loss of interest in activities that you once enjoyed, trouble sleeping or oversleeping, low energy and fatigue, difficulty concentrating, feeling worthless or guilty, and often sometimes thoughts of suicide and death. So depression can occur in response to a range of difficult life experiences such as loss, trauma, abuse, bullying, loneliness, or difficult relationships with important people in our lives. So when people feel depressed, these painful experiences are interpreted as having been brought on by ourselves, by our own personal failings. So self-criticism is a very common feature of depression. We tend to kind of negatively evaluate our own abilities, our past actions, and our personal characteristics. And we kind of lose the capacity to take a balanced view of ourselves and to weigh the positive as well as the negative. So feeling not good enough, inadequate, and to blame for everything is very common in depression. And the consequence of this overly negative view of self is a deep feeling of worthlessness. And what you'll notice is that people who are depressed tend to withdraw from friends and family and often feel that this is now a permanent and unchangeable state. But I suppose it's important to remember that depression, like any emotional state, doesn't have to last forever. With the right tools and the right support, you can develop the ability to manage your mental health and recover. Moving on to anxiety then, anxiety kind of tends to go hand in hand with depression as well. And John mentioned there that we don't really have figures on how prevalent anxiety is. I would say anxiety is in every one of us. Anxiety is just part of the human condition. We live in a very uncertain world, and anxiety is going to arise when we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So anxiety often stems from thinking about things that are going to happen in the future and imagining that it all is going wrong, what we call catastrophizing. It can also stem from kind of ruminating on things that happened in the past and finding fault with the things we said or did. So when we're anxious in this way, the stress response is really activated. So that's just kind of a brief overview of depression and anxiety for you.
And really good points too, Matt. I know at times myself, I've been guilty of looping on thoughts and regurgitating things. And as you say yourself, 9 times out of 10, the thing never happens. Yeah. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose what's important to mention about anxiety is that when we're in that state, it actually activates our stress response. So it feels like we're in danger or we're under some kind of threat, you know. And interestingly, in brain scan research, when we're anxious, the part that's activated is called the amygdala. So that's like the brain's fire alarm. So that's the part of the brain that picks up any signals of danger or threat. And it initiates the fight or flight response. Um, Interestingly, what happens when the amygdala is activated, a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex is shut down. This is the part of the brain where higher order cognitive functions such as reasoning, logical decision making take place. It's really the seat of rationality in our brain. So when we're anxious, that part is kind of shut down. So that means that the kind of fear-based thoughts that are being generated, there's no kind of, reasoning or rational side of ourselves to kind of check out, is this accurate? Is there actually a threat or a danger here? And that can kind of tend to intensify the anxiety and what you're talking about there, John, that loop, of thoughts and spiraling,
Yeah, it's so true. So for me, I'm someone who's been public about my mental health journey, and I'm going to share a little bit of it with you today, just to sort of, I suppose, explain how I went from A to B, but also to highlight that these things are never forever. But first, I'm going to begin with a little piece of writing that helped me during a dark time, and it's about place. And I think place really is important for us in our journeys. So it goes like this. The land I live upon and in is known as the Midlands. Here in the centre of Ireland, we are like the navel of this ancient place. Below my feet lies layers upon layers of limestone. Sometimes when I am standing on this land of ours, I think of the meeting point that this place is, that the water pouring through stone has not just shaped the rock, but us. That in this midland, this middle place, this middle kingdom, we are meeting both life and death, heaven and hell, nature and destruction. That the permeation has made us the people we are, that it has permeated our souls. I thread softly over the stones, they are my makers. Now, I wrote that piece during the various lockdowns that we've all lived through, and I was thinking about the inner world. The sense of place has brought me a great sense of peace. And in this time, because it's in place, I think that we find ourselves and can hold ourselves and feel rooted. But for me, there was a time before I had that sense of peace. And I'm going to go into the background of that. When I was a younger man, I suffered bad mental health, and I didn't have the tools to arm myself to deal with the problems that were arising, and I didn't have the ability to self-soothe. As a young journalist working in Australia, I had the world at my feet a few years ago. I was busy with my career and carrying out investigations, making documentaries, and even setting up a charity. This was, however, before the time of positivity. Now, I'm going to get onto that in a second. But when my mental health started to dip downwards, I firstly didn't know what was happening because I didn't have the emotional knowledge or learning, and secondly, I didn't have the well of positivity to draw from. That journey would ultimately take 4 years from start to finish, where I went through my own dark night of the soul. And it was dark. It was a very difficult time in my life, but it was all the beginning of the most important period of my life. Because I was someone who traveled all my life, but I took the most important journey, the one inside. A bit like the pandemic, I had no roadmap, no tools to understand what was happening and where I was going. But I had something that many of us today have in the midst of crisis. I had my family, I had my friends, and I had my community. Now, that might not sound like a lot when you're faced with mental health concerns, but believe me, it made all the difference. For me, building the well of positivity, as I call it, came from an old place. It came from the farm, it came from nature. I remember as well, it was lambing season on the farm, and all this new life was coming into being, and they needed someone to take care of them, these little lambs. And in bringing those lambs into the world, I was connecting back with some elemental forces, really, and I was starting the journey of building positivity. That well started as a small thing at first. It was giving the lambs a little kiss on the head, if I'm honest, and enjoying their forms, but it soon started to grow into a deeper sense of seeing the ordinary bounty of the everyday. And that well built in me, and even in the darkest hour, I never truly felt alone because I had a sense of my family and my community around me. I think that's the power that we have in Ireland. We're an island of connections, and every stranger is just a conversation away from being a new friend. So anxiety, depression, these are things that I lived with, that I started to manage and battle. And I did that through building my well of positivity. So as someone who'd already faced mental health issues in the past, when the pandemic arrived, I knew I'd be able to deal with it because I had my well of positivity to draw from. So in our short talk today, we're going to break down the tools for managing stress, anxiety, depression, and building a successful life by using your well of positivity. I suppose when we start out talking about this, it's important to know that there are two things in the world. You need to build your well, and then two, you're not alone even if you think you are. We're never alone in this world and in this country. It's an island of connections. So managing our lives, or what I call controlling the controllables, is the one real power you have in life. You can't control your past actions because they've already happened, so it's pointless thinking about them. But we can change our present and future actions towards making ourselves happy and avoiding the pitfalls of anxiety, depression, burnout. So we're going to tag team Matt and I on the various points of managing our lives, and these are the tools to build your well of positivity, to arm you to take on whatever problems might arise. So the main areas of management are stress and anxiety, which we've covered, burnout, work, healthy routines, staying connected to others, sleep, and the GP. So we're going to go through each of these in short form and give you our guide on how to manage them. So stress and anxiety, we've covered this already, but I'm just going to go into it a little bit. So we all know that stress is a killer. It's a really tough thing to deal with, and it's something I deal with. And in the middle of the pandemic, particularly, stress can breed anxiety, and that's something none of us want. Matt, can you tell us a little bit more about what actually stress is?
Yeah, stress is our body's response to pressure and demanding situations or dangerous situations. So when we're in a stressful situation, our fight or flight stress response is activated. So what this does is it gets your heart rate increases, so you get blood to your muscles quicker, your breathing speeds up to get more oxygen in, and your adrenaline starts pumping, which speeds up brain activity. So all of this kind of enables us and primes us to take decisive action to deal with the demands of whatever stressful situation we're in. Now, a certain amount of stress can be a positive, as it keeps us alert and prepared to deal with danger. However, danger is if we're exposed to stressors continuously throughout the day with limited or no respite. There's been a huge amount of research that has shown that constant activation of this stress response has a very detrimental effect on not only our mental health and well-being, but also our physical health. There was a very influential study a few years ago on adverse childhood experiences, where they interviewed 17,000 people in the United States. And what they found was that people who experienced high levels of stress, whether through trauma, abuse, neglect, or significant life events, experiencing high levels of stress as a child was strongly associated with a range of health issues later on in life, including cancer, diabetes, mental health issues. It was also strongly associated with kind of increased use of alcohol and drugs. So stress has a hugely wearing effect on our body if we're living in that kind of fight or flight state all the time. So it's usually important if you're dealing with a lot of stress in your life, if you have kids, if maybe you have elderly parents who are unwell, maybe you have difficult relationships with important people in your lives. It's really important that we take time to engage in activities that help you relax and unwind, whatever they may be. It really depends on the individual person. It might be going to the gym, or it might be going for a walk, or talking to a friend, or reading a book, whatever it is that kind of helps you relax and unwind. What have you found helpful to dealing with stress, John?
Well, I suppose, Matt, for me, my secret weapon has been exercise. There's been days when I've felt the pressure of the pandemic, and the road outside has been the way to deal with it and come back to a proper equilibrium. I think that in exercise, whether it was walking, running, swimming, I found a way to manage manage the problems in my life and break them down into smaller parts. And so often I go to the pool and I have a problem worrying me when I get into the pool, and it's gone by the time I finish, because I've created a mental barrier between me and that. And I said, this is my time for myself to enjoy. So I think it's a really positive thing for me, and I know that it is for millions of other people as well. I suppose, moving on, anxiety is the bedfellow of stress, and that, for me, when I was going through my period of mental health difficulties, anxiety was probably the hardest thing to live with, because it seemed to be there all the time. And I suppose it can be physical and mental, and its worst form can bring on panic attacks, which I experienced many years ago. So for anxiety, we need to develop our self-soothing tools, and by doing this, we gain ways to calm ourselves and let ourselves know that even the biggest cause of anxiety, when examined properly, isn't so scary. And as I always say, the monster is never that big. What would the clinical view of that be, Matt?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Sean. I suppose, like, the first step when you're dealing with anxiety is you have to kind of calm the nervous system, because, as we mentioned earlier, when we feel anxious, it activates our fight or flight response. So our heart rate is pumping, our breath is kind of quickening up, and our muscles are tensing. Okay, we're in that kind of fear, kind of monitoring for threat kind of state, and our thoughts start racing in that kind of state of mind. So what we need to do in that situation is really try and kind of bring some calm back into the body, kind of bring some kind of regulate our nervous system. And what the best way of doing this is the breath. It sounds very simple, but a slow, deep breath is extremely regulating for our nervous system. It kind of helps slow down the heart and relax any tension in the body. So what I always do with clients is I ask them just to kind of practice taking a deep breath. So what you do is you just kind of breathe in through your nose, nice and deep. Feel it that it goes all the way down to your stomach. And sometimes people might count maybe to 4 on the in-breath, and then breathe out again slowly on the out-breath through the mouth. Now, you might need to do that for a few minutes before you notice calm kind of coming back into your body, but it does work. Other things I've found helpful are kind of having a go-to mantra in a difficult moment. If you're feeling very kind of wound up and very anxious, something like telling yourself, I can get through this, or this will pass, and some kind of positive self-talk that's like a life raft in a difficult moment. It's usually helpful to kind of think back on your own life and think of maybe when you're in similar situations in the past, how did you get through it? Because it's almost guaranteed you've had kind of anxiety or, high levels of stress in the past, and you've managed to get through it. So kind of reminding yourself that, well, I've faced this before and I can handle it. I can get through it. Just reminding yourself that can be very helpful. And I suppose with anxiety as well, once you've kind of brought the level of kind of hyper arousal down and you're kind of in a more kind of neutral kind of frame of mind, I think it's important to kind of actually examine our anxious thoughts. And it's important to remember that thoughts are not facts. Oftentimes when we have an anxious thought, it kind of lands like a kind of message from the heavens, and it has the ring of kind of gospel truth to it. And if it's an anxious thought and it's kind of anticipating danger or things going wrong, that kind of leads to kind of our body to react. We react with fear, we react with more anxiety. It has these consequences and effects. But when we go back and examine if there's any evidence to back up our initial thought, there often isn't. So sometimes we need to kind of challenge our anxious thoughts a little bit, question if they're fully accurate and if there's any basis for thinking that way. And remind ourselves that 9 times out of 10, the bad thing that we're imagining doesn't actually come to pass.
Yeah, very true. Moving on to burnout, because I think we're going to touch on this a little bit today, because it's something that it's in the zeitgeist at the moment. Everyone is talking about burnout in relation to the pandemic, but burnout is something that I experienced myself for the first time last year, and it had come on the back of really a lot of work for a long period of time and not taking a break. And it took me a number of weeks really to get over it. And I used my well of positivity. I went back to the well to use the tools and tips that we're talking about today to get over it. And that was exercise, sleep, healthy routines, eating right. And slowly I emerged back from it. And I suppose I made sure that I put in place enough parameters to make sure that it wouldn't happen again. Matt, what is burnout from a clinical view?
So burnout is a state of mental and physical exhaustion brought on by prolonged experience of kind of work-related stress. Burnout is a phenomenon often related to our job, but it's also common to get burnout from other kind of unpaid forms of stressful work, such as maybe looking after children or caring for elderly parents. There are a number of factors that predispose people to burnout, and these include heavy workloads and working long hours, a poor work-life balance. If you're kind of working all the time, but you're not doing anything to look after yourself, if you're not going to the well of positivity, as John mentioned, you're not kind of doing anything to kind of burn off that stress and unwind. Other factors that kind of can lead to burnout are a lack of support, dysfunctional workplace dynamics. Maybe there's an office bully, or you have a micromanaging boss that causes stress. Lack of control over your work is a big factor. So if you have in your job, if you have no input into, let's say, your schedule or what your work you're assigned or how heavy the workload is, that can kind of lead to people to burnout as well. Another factor is lack of recognition of your work. And I suppose like burnout is particularly common in caring professions or jobs that require emotional labor. So what happens in burnout is that people experience excessive stress, and they experience fatigue, irritability and anger, a loss of interest in work, and feeling unappreciated. Oftentimes people it shakes people's sense of identity, and there can be a sense of depersonalization as well. Like we spoke earlier, burnout is really a stress-related phenomenon and work-related stress. So it's kind of having the same effects on the body that we spoke about earlier. And as we said, if there's no kind of efforts to mitigate that stress through self-care activities, through going to the well, that's when burnout happens. Just as important to mention as well that oftentimes burnout is associated with increased use of drugs and alcohol as a way to deal with all these kind of feelings. It can also lead to vulnerability to illness as well, the same way as stress can.
Yeah, a very, very important topic to talk about. Moving on with our tools to control the controllables, we're going to touch on work. We've already talked about it there in relation to burnout, but I suppose in brief, the pandemic has actually brought about new modes of work for all of us. People are working from home. People are maybe partly in the office now or partly at home. So it's a whole new dynamic. And then some people weren't working at all in certain industries, and they had a protracted period where they were wondering what it was that they did in the world. So we've all grown up wanting to be productive, wanting to have a job that gives us purpose. And for many of us, our jobs are a huge part of our identity. We proudly say, I'm a builder, I'm an accountant, I'm a farmer, and I work and take pride in that fact. But when our jobs are cut off from us, we can feel a bit helpless. So Matt, what would your view on that be?
Yeah, I think this is something particularly relevant at the moment where there's been lockdowns and people have lost their jobs or been away from their work for extended periods of time. And we've seen the impact of that on people, it seems to be kind of the modern phenomenon that work has taken the place of maybe religion or community as our main source of meaning and purpose in life. Not that there's anything wrong with that per se. Personally, I get a lot of kind of feel a great sense of achievement and reward from my own work. I suppose the difficulty is that if your identity is totally bound up with your job, and the job goes for whatever reason, whether it's recession or pandemic or even retirement, if your identity is totally tied up with the job, when it goes, it can precipitate a personal crisis and a real loss of meaning and purpose in the world. So I think it's important to cultivate a range of interests and really explore alternative sources of meaning, so that we're not kind of putting all our eggs in one basket, that work is not the be all and end all of our lives.
Yeah, very true. Moving on, we're going to talk about healthy routines. Healthy routines is really what gets us through, in my view, difficult times. For example, we lived through the 5K limit and during the pandemic, and we have the movement of freedom, or the freedom of movement back, and that's a wonderful thing. So we can walk, run, cycle, and make a time in our day for this. And even though it may not be fun to start with or enjoying, it does get better. Healthy routines, I suppose, make and break us. Each day I also make, as I mentioned, time to exercise, whether that's going for a run or a walk. It's something to have the wind and the sun on my back. And in a sense, it's the center point of my day, where I manage my stress and I manage my anxiety, and where I get to make sense of my day. Now, Dr. George Sheehan was a cardiologist and a runner from the USA, and he used to say that today was the great event, that you have to make today your masterpiece. And I always loved that statement, because it's so true. The walk, the run, the swim, the bicycle ride, though, that is your opportunity to make your day count, reward yourself for hard work done, and get out in the fresh air. And I suppose it's in a sense, it's all self-care. So Matt, what would your clinical view be on that?
Absolutely, John. Yeah, incorporating self-care activities that kind of look after body and mind into your daily routine is hugely important there. And I can know from knowing you, John, I know how much that this going for a run or going for a walk or going for a swim, how restorative that is for you. And it gives you a great sense of well-being, and kind of helps you kind of manage the kind of stresses in your life. So I think kind of blocking out time in your day to go for a walk or to talk to a friend or read a book or whatever activity that is restorative for you is really essential to our well-being. There's the analogy of the kind of the oxygen mask on the plane. So when you're on a flight and they're given the pre-flight instructions, what they say is that in an emergency, you must put your own mask on first before you help others. And the logic behind that is that if you're not looking after yourself, if you're not taking care of your own needs, you're not going to be capable of helping anyone else. So it's really the same with having a healthy self-care routine. If you're not taking that time out in your day to care for yourself, the well will run dry. And I think sometimes we kind of tend to think that these things like going for a run or going for a walk are maybe frivolous or non-essential, but I think we need to reframe that a little bit and kind of recognize that these things are actually really important to our own kind of health and well-being.
Yeah, they really are, and that's your opportunity to make your masterpiece. Moving on, staying connected to others. Matt has touched upon it there. I think it's a really hugely important aspect in controlling the controllables with depression and anxiety and burnout. So we're in a pandemic still. I know we have a sort of freedom now, but we're still in it. But so is everyone else. So it's a shared experience, and we can use that to our advantage. And what I mean by that is, by now, nearly everyone in the country has a mobile phone. And of course, so many of you are tuning in via the internet. So there's internet access as well. For me, I have a group of friends I call each week to find out what's happening in their part of the country or their part of the world. I call it the check-in. I find out what's happening in their lives and what they're doing with themselves. And you realize two things when you talk to your friends. One, life is going on regardless of a pandemic. People are falling in love, building houses, starting new jobs. Two, the world didn't stop, so why should you? And three, that your friends will reconnect you to the good things in your life. So for me, having a wide group of friends to call upon allows me to not overburden one friend, which I think is really important, and it allows me to have different opinions and news coming into my life. So staying connected with good friends and family really makes a huge difference to our mental health in this time. Even social media, which we hear so many negative things about, and we have to be careful with it, is great for talking to friends on the other side of the world. So we just don't want to get sucked into the fake news sites of the world. So staying connected with others allows us to feel support and give support and feel like we have a network around us, even if anything should go wrong. And Matt, would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think the pandemic has kind of made us realize that more than ever, just the importance of human contact and connecting with others. Something that maybe we took for granted or didn't realize the importance of before, you know. It's like we're social animals, and if we don't kind of speak with others and connect with other human beings, you know, we kind of tend to get isolated very quickly and turn in ourselves a bit. So, like as you were saying there, John, just kind of reaching out and again, kind of making it part of your routine. You know, sometimes you might kind of find it hard to find time, or you might be reluctant to pick up the phone, but when you do, it's always worth it. You always feel better after having a good call with a friend, you know.
Yeah, totally. And you realize problems are shared and maybe not as big because you get another perspective. So moving on to our next aspect in controlling controllables, it's a really important one. It's sleep. Sleep is a very precious thing in times of stress, and in a time of global stress such as the pandemic, we have to mind our sleeping life like we do our physical fitness life. So sleep is a way to balance out our days, and good sleep hygiene, as it's called, is really important because it sets us up for the next day. Keeping our sleep routine, even if we find ourselves not working, is really important. So getting to bed early, getting up on time, staying in bed might be tempting, but unless you're really tired or run down, it's not your friend because you're breaking routines. So we need to keep our days and nights structured, and that's essentially what it is. So Matt, is there a clinical view on sleep?
Yeah, there is. I suppose just in my own experience, I find that sleep is very underestimated as a factor in mental health. I can't tell you how many clients I've met who are struggling with sleep, and just the effects of that, the exhaustion, irritability, inability to concentrate, and the low mood they experience after not getting enough sleep, all of that really exacerbates mental health difficulties. So the importance of getting a good night's sleep is just enormous, to be honest. And as you mentioned, John, a consistent bedtime routine is very important to get enough sleep. There are a couple other things to kind of bear in mind. I think just be mindful of the food and drink you consume before bedtime. Caffeine, alcohol, sugary foods, all those things can disrupt your sleep. Something that's become a huge barrier in recent years to sleep is the blue light in smartphones. So the blue light on smartphones, what it does is it actually suppresses the production of melatonin. Now that's the hormone that actually puts us to sleep. So, you know, usually at nighttime, melatonin will be secreted, or if we haven't, or whenever we've been awake for a long time, melatonin will be secreted, and that will put us to sleep. But when we're looking at our phones before we go to bed, the melatonin is suppressed, so that keeps us awake for longer. So that means it's really important that we avoid kind of using smartphones or looking at screens for at least an hour or two before bedtime. And I think, as you mentioned, just to go back to the point about kind of your bedtime routine, I think it's really important to kind of develop a routine that works for you to unwind and just kind of train your body that it's time to go to sleep now. Maybe that might be kind of taking a bath before you go to bed, or reading a book, just kind of relaxing activities that kind of help you unwind and kind of get you in the right state of mind to kind of fall asleep. You know, hugely important.
Yeah, totally agree. So moving on to our final topic, it's mental health, the GP. I wanted to touch on this because for many of us, we don't like going to see the doctor, or we leave it to the last minute, and men in particular can be very guilty of this. But they're really our first line of defense when things are down. So for me, in my mental health journey, it was a call that I resisted for a long time. But it was a call that set about changing my life for the better, because I realized it was okay to feel, as the Cycle Against Suicide people say, it's okay to not feel okay, and it's totally okay to go and get help. So the first step in asking for help is always the hardest. It takes time to do that. So I suppose knowing that it's not the end of the world if you are dealing with these topics that we're talking about today, that you can reach out and that there are people there. Matt, is there a professional view on this?
Yeah, I think just from a counselling and therapy point of view, like oftentimes clients will tell me that it actually took them weeks or even months to pick up the phone for the first time. Just taking that first step and asking for help is often the hardest one of all, you know, and it takes, as you said, it takes a fair bit of courage. And I suppose what's important to know is that if you kind of link in with your GP, they are usually a great support and they can kind of direct you to the right support. And also if therapy or counselling is something you're interested in, just to be aware that counsellors are very acutely aware that how hard it is to kind of come to counselling for the first time. You know, we've all done counselling ourselves, and we're aware of how difficult it is to take that first step. So, you know, we understand that we're going to take make you feel comfortable and at ease, you know, and you won't be judged, you know, which is really important.
So important. There's no judgment in these journeys. There's only acceptance and embracing. So those are the tools, as what we call controlling controllables, for building your well. Building your well by doing all these things will get you through to the other side. You have to know that everything will come to an end. A brighter day will come where we can all be together again, such as the pandemic, that will end. Mental health difficulties do come to an end. There's a start and an end point. The pandemic is an opportunity for change. And really you only have one job in this time, and that's to take care of yourself. Once, like Matt said, with the oxygen mask, once you take care of yourself, you can then help other people. So building your well of positivity will allow you to prosper in life. And I think it's something about when you go through these dark nights of the soul, whether it's with depression or anxiety or burnout, that there is a transformation of the self and a transformation of the soul. And if you use your tools on your well of positivity to draw from, that you'll be able to tackle, measure and overcome any difficulties. So that's our talk for today. We've really enjoyed going through this. We hope that you found it helpful. And I suppose knowing that nothing is forever, that everything is present. Maybe Matt, you have a final word you'd like to say?
Yeah, and I suppose, like, I think mental health, I think it's not a destination you reach. It's something you have to maintain throughout your life, you know. And what John has talked about today in terms of building as well positivity, I think in some form we all have to do something like that, just to kind of look after ourselves and face the difficulties and challenges that everyone is going to face in life, you know. So yeah, it's a process of trial and error, finding what works for you and incorporating that into your daily life, you know.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and take care of yourselves. And I hope that we hope that you're in good spirits. Thank you.
Thank you.